Hey guys, as you can see on the screen, this is our review video for test number 4. It's for Unit 89 and Masechet Bava Kama. Let's start. Okay, so we'll start with Unit 8. Unit 8 began the new parak, the Mishnah Hameniach et Akkad, which goes down to the Gemara at the bottom of the daf and actually to the top of the next Amud. We'll quickly take a look at the Mishnah first before we get into the analysis in the Gemara. Okay, here is the Mishnah marked off over here, including a slash mark to separate the Reisha and the Seifa. It's really one situation that has two outcomes, so you really could say there is no Reisha and Seifa, but at least there are two halachot that we can be discussing here. Again, the topic here is what happens if a person leaves their object in a public place. Reshut harabim. Reish stands for Reshut harabim. Is it free game? Can someone step on it? If they step on it and break it, do you not have to pay because the person left it out there in danger? So the Mishnah seems to say that you'd be patur. If someone leaves their kad out in Reshut harabim, out in public, someone else comes along, but it's kalba and trips over Vishivra and breaks it, patur. They are patur for breaking it. Seems like because the person left it out in danger, it's the owner of the kad's fault. What happens now if the person gets hurt tripping over it? If the person was injured by it, the owner of this kad, this barrel, this chavit, this object, chayiv b'nisko, must pay for the damage. As you remember correctly, Unit 8 does not really discuss these halachot per se, but it deals specifically with the way the Mishnah is worded, that we're talking about one situation with one object. The first time it calls it a kad, which usually means jar, which is smaller than a chavit, which means a barrel, and for some reason the same object is referred to as a kad and a chavit, even though those are two totally different words. The Gemara is going to discuss why that is. Okay, we're going to start our analysis by really just looking at the first line of the Gemara, the one that's highlighted in green over here, those 4 words. So again, as our Mishnah points out, as we saw before, the word kad and chavit were used on our Mishnah. The Gemara uses 4 words to point that out. Patach b'chad, kad, the Gemara points out, it opened, started with the word kad, v'siyem chavit, and finished with the word chavit. The Gemara is asking a question, pointing that out, why is that? So although your first answer could be it is a mistake, which is possible, the Gemara is going to point out this is probably not the case because we have 2 other Mishnayot that do something very similar. So happens once, you could say it's a mistake. Happens twice, maybe it's a mistake. Happens 3 times, chances are it's on purpose. This phrase circled in red, Tananami, is one you need to know for the test. Tananami literally means it was also taught in a Mishnah. And Tananami in this case, and in most cases as far as I know, maybe all cases as far as I know, is used to introduce a Mishnah, Tanan. Nami also, that also teaches something similar to the topic that you're learning. So the same way in this case, we saw it started with kad and finished with chavit. We have 2 Mishnayot that do something similar. What are those 2 Mishnayot? Let's read them. Before we do that, I should point out that you don't really the content of these Mishnayot are not very important for the test. The important thing you need to know for the test is that the Gemara quotes 2 Mishnayot and that use a similar wording to our Mishnah to show that our Mishnah is not a mistake, that it's intentionally switching the word kad and chavit around. It'll probably be extra credit I'll ask you guys if you want to know the content of the Mishnah, but we're going to read through it anyway just so we can get it in the flow of the Gemara. So again, after our Mishnah says patach b'kad b'siyem chavit, the Gemara says, the Mishnah starts with kad and siyem chavit. The Gemara says the following: Tananami, there's a Mishnah that also teaches that. Zeba b'chavito, if someone has their barrel, there's your barrel, the zeba b'karato, and someone else is walking, so one person is walking down the street with the barrel, and one person is walking down the street with the beam, right, straight down the sidewalk. Nishbara kado shel zeh b'karato shel zeh. If this person's kad breaks on the other person's beam, patur. The person who owner of the beam is patur because they both had right of way. The important thing here, though, is obviously that it started with the word chavit, talking about the objects of chavit, and then it said, the kad broke. What do you mean, what kad? It's a chavit. So as the Gemara points out, patach b'chavit v'siyem b'chad. Here, kad. It started with chavit and it ended with the word kad, again, showing that those 2 words somehow could refer to the same object. Then again, v'tnan nami, and there's another Mishnah that says that. Zeba b'chavito shel yain, some person's carrying a barrel of wine. V'zeba kado shel davash, someone's holding a kad of honey, so the honey is a kad. Nistakach chavit shel davash, the barrel of honey. Now again, here, at first it was called a kad, now it's called a chavit shel davash. So the barrel in this case of honey cracked, again, even though it said kad before. Shavach zeh, the person spilled out his wine, but he'tzil had davash, and he saves the honey, l'tocho, into his barrel of wine, which is now empty. Ein lo ella, I forget what the word is there. Anyways, demei scharo, I believe the word is. The point is that he only gets paid for the amount of time he worked, but he doesn't get paid for the honey that he poured out. We discussed why that is in class. Side point, not important for the test. But the important part is, as the Gemara points out, patach b'kad v'siyem b'chavit. Here it started with kad, it called the davash a kad, then it said a chavit, it's a barrel. So there's a second situation, another Tananami, now our third situation actually. We have our original Mishnah and two Tananamis, other Mishnayot, where with Kad and Chavit were both used to refer to the same object. So the question we're left at is why is that? And that's what Rav Papa is about to answer. Okay, so here before we read Rav Papa, we're getting. I'm sorry, these are screenshots from the notes we did in class. We're getting a little bit of a different look at the layout here. I'm just going to slide it to the screen. We're not cutting, nothing's cut off. Different layout of how we marked everything off, but it's the same thing. We have our Gemara pointing out we have 2 times says Tananami, quoting another Mishnah. Underlined in purple is the actual Mishnah. And then in both cases, after the Mishnah, the Gemara points out at both these Mishnayot, that's why it's Tananami, they taught in a Mishnah very similarly, they do the same thing. So why is that now? The question on the table is very nice. Now we know it's not a mistake. So if it's purposely using the word kad and chavit to refer to the same object, why are we teaching this? Why is it doing that? Rav Papa, hainu kad, hainu chavit. It's teach us that kad and chavit can be used to mean the same thing. Hainu means like this is. This is a jar. This is a bat. This is a kad. This is a chavit. The same object can be called a kad and a chavit. Why? Because it's reasonable for two people when they. It's reasonable for people when they look at a barrel, at least at the time of the Gemara, when this Mishnah was written, I should say this Mishnah, or all these Mishnayot, it was reasonable to think that if I have an object in front of me, I could call that a kad, or I can think of that as a chavit, if it's a barrel or a jar. Either one I could think of as a kad and think of as a chavit. So that's what Rav Papa is teaching us, that and the same object could be a kad, the same object could be a chavit, and it all depends on how you're thinking about the object when you're talking about it. So now the question is, who cares? So very nice. Rav Papa taught, according to Rav Papa, this Mishnah are teaching us that kad and chavit can really refer to the same object. And when we look at an object, you might think kad, you might think chavit, and you might look if you see a chavit, you might think kad. If you see a kad, you might think chavit, and that's normal. L'may nafkamina, asks the Gemara. L'may nafkamina means who cares? What comes out of that whole difference? Why does that matter? The Gemara answers l'mekach l'memchar, for business purposes. Now, what does that mean for business purposes? When would it matter? So as we pointed out, what's teaching us in general, now we'll look at Rashi to see an example, is that when it comes to business, a person can claim they were thinking X, even if the other person they were dealing with was thinking Y, as long as both X and Y fit these words. So someone in a business deal might say chavit, or they might see a kad and think about it as a chavit. They might see chavit and think about it as a kad, and that would be fine for business purposes, and they can claim that, and therefore they could say, well, you can't take money from me because you don't know what I was thinking. Let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Shebiyad hamocher," it's in the hands of the seller, the merchant. Lateitlo eza sheyirtzeh, to give whichever one he wants. Va'afilu hitno imo chavit, even though he made a condition that he wants a chavit, demashma gadol, that implies the bigger one. No tein lo kad shikatana. The seller can give a kad which is smaller, because the seller can claim, when you said chavit, I thought you were actually referring to a jar, and that's because both are reasonable to think. And that's what. Therefore, this halacha is relevant. It does make sense. What's the difference? Who cares that the two words can refer to the same thing? No, in business that actually matters. If you give someone money and say, "Give me a chavit," and they bring you a smaller jar, they could say, "Sorry, I'm keeping the money. You're not getting your money back. No refunds here," because that's what I was thinking when you said chavit. I thought you meant kad, and it's fair for me to think jar when you say chavit. Now, after this, the Gemara is going to actually move on and ask about, well, Kefan, you just told me that for business purposes, in a business transaction, the seller can claim that he was thinking one, he was thinking the other. Well, it's not really about the seller. It's whoever has the money in their hand can claim, I don't have to give the money back to you because I was thinking one thing, and what I was thinking actually is possible, and therefore you can't get your money back. So in what situation would this be a chidush? In what situation would you be teaching us something new? Just to talk about chidush for a minute. So chidush literally comes from the word chadash. It means a new idea. When we talk about a new idea in halach, it means something that isn't obviously true. Whenever we see a mishnah, the mishnah has to be teaching us something that you can claim that the opposite is true, and therefore the mishnah need to teach us this because it's not obvious that this thing would be true. So when we get in now, the halacha that we're taught now, that a person can claim they were thinking one thing and keep the money. So in what situation would that be a chidush? Now what we're going to do is explain this before we get into the Gemara. So we're talking about a situation where the seller gets to keep the money. What's really important here is not the fact that it's the buyer or the seller. That's how we're going to frame it. That's probably a mistake on my behalf, but that's where we are right now. It's actually really about who has the money. It's about keeping the money. The key here is the keeping the money. So let's say that in this case the seller has the money. Okay, so if somebody has the money, when would it be a chidush to say that they keep the money? So if they already have the money in their hands and most people agree with them, that wouldn't be a chidush. If most people think the way the person who has the money, in this case the seller has the money, and most people think the way the seller does, of course the seller gets to keep the money. That wouldn't be a chidush. There was no reason to think the opposite. A, you have the money in your hands, and B, most people agree with you. When might you think that the seller would have to give the money if most people think the way the buyer does? So if when the seller says, oh, when you said chavid, I thought you meant a jar, but 75% of the people in the world would not think that those two things mean the same thing. When they hear chavid, they mean barrel. They think barrel. Then it's, wow, I can't believe that the seller still gets to keep the money. That's when it would be a chidush. We're about to read that into the Gemara. So here we go. You can see the circled and highlighted parts is to break up the Gemara. We're up to Amar Papa again. Hainu kat, hainu chavi. L'mayin afmin. Who cares? L'mekach u'memchar. When it comes to business transactions, hey chidami. When is this chidush? When is this chidush? When is this relevant? Ilema, if you'll say ba'atur de kada lo kari chavid v'chavid lo kari kada. If we're talking about a situation where nobody calls a chavid. Nobody calls a kad and chavit, nobody calls a chavit a kad. Meaning nobody thinks the way the seller does, or almost nobody thinks the way the seller does. Hello, karula. No one calls it that, so of course the seller doesn't have to give the money. Of course, the person with the money is not going to have to give it up because the buyer says, "Oh, well, I was thinking this," or the person who's trying to get the money is saying, "Oh, this is what I was thinking." If almost no one thinks that way, you can't say that's what you were thinking. So the Gemara says, "Lo, it's not a problem. It still is necessary to teach us. It is a chidush. In what situation? Deruba karule lekada kada. If a majority call a kad with a chavita and a chavit, they don't think that you can mix these two things up. Most people only think one way. However, vikanami dekar lechavita kada chavita. There are some people who call a barrel a kad and a kad a chavit. Chavita kad or kad a chavit. There are some people who might think the way the seller does. And since there's some people, 25% of the people might think the way the seller does, or the person who has the money, then you might think, well, since most people still back the person who doesn't have the money, who's trying to get the money, since most people back the buyer should get his money back. So that's the Gemara says no. Mahu detama, you might think zil bata ruba, you should follow the rove, and therefore the seller has to give the money up. Kamashlan, it comes to teach us to einol chimba monach arov. We don't follow the majority when it comes to monetary matters. And if one person has the money, even if the majority goes against him, even if the majority it would be against the seller and would cause the seller to give up the money, because the majority of the people don't call a kad a chavit and a chavit a kad. Still, the majority is not enough, and when it comes to getting money from somebody, we don't follow the majority. Why? So we discussed that in class, because majority is not proof. Majority, which is rove, which is one of the terms you have to know, tells you that if you want, you could follow the majority, but it doesn't tell you 100% that that's what's true. Just to give you an example, let's take this statement. Most people are not Kohanim. The word most, rove, obviously means most or majority. So most people are not Kohanim. Now, does that mean if I select a person at random, I know for sure they're not a Kohen? Of course not. It just means that it's likely that most people are not Kohanim, and therefore in a situation where I don't know if someone's a Kohen or Yisrael, and I have no way of figuring it out. So in a situation like that, I can actually assume the person is a Yisrael or a Levi and not a Kohen, and that might have halachic ramifications, might affect things halachically. But the point we're trying to make here is that rove doesn't prove that someone's not a Kohen. It just says it's likely that someone's not a Kohen. So going back to our case, if somebody has the money in their hands and the buyer is trying to get the money from the seller, the buyer says, well, 75% of people think that way I do. That doesn't mean that 100%, that doesn't prove that's what the seller was thinking. Not at all. So therefore, since rove is not proof, rove just tells you what's more likely, and in order to get money from someone, you need proof. So in our case, ein holchim al monach rov, you don't go based on the majority, and therefore, if some people call a chad a chavit and chavit a kad, the seller can claim, since they have the money in their hands, that they were going with the 25%, and since you can't prove otherwise, the seller does not have to give the money up. And just to demonstrate this one more time, so again, let's say we're talking about a case where the seller gets to keep the money. So when would it be a chidush? When would it be like something that's you would not have known? It's not obvious that the seller gets to keep the money. Well, if most people think the way the seller does, that's not a chidush. Of course he gets to keep the money. He's got the money, and most people agree with him. Most people think his way. But if most people think the way the buyer does, or the person who doesn't have the money, and they're trying to get the money, and most people would agree with them, you might say, well, since most people would agree with you, you should be able to get the money back from the seller. The answer is no. Even in that case, the buyer doesn't get the money back from the seller. Whoever is trying to get the money can't get it back, even though they have the majority on their side. That's a chidush, because you could easily think that you go based on the majority. And again, the Gemara answers, Ein holchin mamon acharov, that when it comes to monetary matters, you have to totally prove that someone owes you money in order to get it from them, not that it's more likely. I will go back at the end and read through at the end of the whole video, read through units 8 and 9, just so you can get see it one more time as a flow in the Gemara. Before we finish up reviewing this unit, we're going to go on to go over a couple of terms that we worked on. The terms pshita, ma'od, kamash malan. Our Gemara didn't use the word pshita, but it used the term ma'od, kamash malan, and pshita usually goes with that. So we're going to see an example where that is, where else in Gemara that's seen, to remind us how these terms are used. So if you remember correctly, we looked at a Gemara in Masechet Brachot about women and being patur from tefillin and kriyat Shema. We have a rule, the rule that's mentioned somewhere else in the Gemara, Masechet Kedushin, that women are exempt from all time-bound mitzvot that are only relevant at a certain time of the year, or only a certain time of day. So once we know that's a rule, therefore, any time you have a mitzvah that's time-bound, of course you know that women are exempt. Women are paturot. Yet, if you look on our Mishnah, what does it say? Women, servants, and children are exempt from kriyat Shema and tefillin. Kriyat Shema and tefillin are both mitzvah aseh zman grama. So if that's true, this should not be in our Mishnah, because it's not a chidush. It's something we know already. We know women are exempt from all time-bound mitzvot. So why are you telling me this? That wouldn't be a chidush in the Mishnah. And that's what the Gemara asks. Kriyat Shema. Women are exempt from Kriyat Shema. The Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? And that's the first term you need to know, right? Isn't that obvious? It's not a chidush what you're telling me. Whenever you see Pshita, the Gemara is asking, it's not a chidush. We know this already. The Gemara then says, no. Mitzvah shezman gramu. Why is it pashu? Because it's a time-bound mitzvah. We know they're paturot. They're exempt from time-bound mitzvah. From this rule that we know already in Kedushin. Why are you repeating this? Why are you giving me an example here? So Gemara says, no. Mahu detem. And here's the next phrase you need to know. You might have thought, it's explaining why it's not obvious. You might have thought, that Shema is so important because it makes God king. It discusses God as being king. That even though normally they'd be paturot, in this case they'd be chayavot, kamash malan, it teaches us that the opposite is true. They actually are paturot. So what you have here is Pshita, the Gemara asking, isn't that obvious, right? This rule should be obvious that women are paturot from Shema, let's say from Shema, because they're exempt from time-bound mitzvah, and this is a time-bound mitzvah. The Gemara says, no, Mahu Ditema, you might have thought the opposite was true. And since there's a way of thinking that the opposite is true, in this case, because Shema is so important, we wouldn't let them out of it. Therefore, is a chidush, kamashmalan, the opposite had to be taught to us. Same thing with tefillin. Women are tefillin, they're patur from tefillin. The Gemara quotes from the Mishnah. Pshita, isn't that obvious? And the Gemara says, Mahu Ditema, you might have thought, since it's connected to mezuzah, related to mezuzah, and women are chayavot in mezuzah, they'd also be chayavot in tefillin. They're mentioned together actually in the parsha of Kriyat Shema, the commandment to have a mezuzah and wear tefillin are both in the same pasuk. So you might think that the same way that women are chayavot to have a mezuzah in their house, they're also chayavot in tefillin. Kamashmalan, the Mishnah teaches us that the opposite is true, that women are actually beturot from tefillin. So what Mahav Detem in this case again tells you is why it's not so obvious. It might seem to you that it's obvious because there's a time-bound mitzvah. Women are exempt from all time-bound mitzvot. But I can make an argument why women would be this might be an exception. Therefore, the Mishnah did have to teach us it's not so pashut that women are paturot from both Kriyat Shema and tefillin. And again, that's how Pshita works. Asks, isn't it obvious? Mahav Detem tells you what you might have thought. Then it tells you what you might have thought, and then it says kamashmalan, the opposite is true. The example we had is, let's say you have a rule. You are allowed to use your phone on an airplane. So that's a rule that we know is 100% true. Why would a stewardess get up and say, oh, you should know you're allowed to use your phone on this flight? Pshita, let's say you were putting this into the same framework. You'd say, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Of course you can use your phone on a plane. Since when can you not? No, isn't that obvious? So why are you telling me this? No, you might have thought, well, you have thought that we are afraid of terrorism, and because we're afraid of terrorism nowadays, you're not allowed to use your phone on a plane. Therefore, Kamash Malan, the stewardess had to teach us that the opposite is true. That the Kamash Malan, that you can use your plane on this flight, even though you might have thought we were afraid of terrorism. Which brings us to Unit 9. Okay, if you remember correctly, Unit 9 is basically broken up into 4 parts. By 4, I mean 5. Always mixing those two numbers up. So we have the Gemara quoting from the Mishnah, asking a question on the Mishnah. answers to that question, a problem with one of the answers, a totally different way of solving the problem, and a situation that came up and discussing why the ruling was the way it was in these two situations, actually. So we'll do this one step at a time. Okay, so let's take it away. So again, if you remember, our Mishnah had said that if someone leaves a barrel out in public, we'll go with Reuven and Shimon. If Reuven leaves a barrel out in public, and Shimon breaks it, that Shimon is patur from paying for it, ostensibly, presumably, which means that this is the way it seems. Seemingly, that's a better way of saying it. Seemingly, because Reuven was the one who endangered his barrel, so it's not Shimon's fault. So Gemara asked the question, though, just because someone put their barrel out in public doesn't mean you have the right to just not watch where you're going. My patur, why is Shimon patur for breaking the barrel? He needed to, li yunei mezel, watch where he's going. So part one, the Gemara is asking a question on the ruling of the Mishnah. Then the Gemara offers three possible answers. Each of these answers, what happens is that we say, you're right, a person does have to watch where they're going. So why in the Mishnah was Shimon patur for stepping on the barrel? But we say the Mishnah must be talking about a situation where Shimon would not have to watch where he's going. Why would that be? Three possibilities. Amri debe Rav, Bishmei Rav. Rav's student said in his name. The Mishnah is talking about a situation where Reuven filled the entire Rishut HaRabim, public area, with barrels. And therefore Shimon didn't have to just wait there because he had nowhere to go. He's allowed to step through the barrels and break them. Shmuel said, what's going on? But the Mishnah was talking about where it was in the dark. And since it was in the dark, normally you would have to watch where you're going, and you'd be chayav for stepping on something in public. But since it was dark out, that's what the Mishnah is talking about. That's why Shimon was patur from breaking it, because he couldn't have watched where he was going. Rav Yochanan said, but Karen Zavet, it's where it's around the corner. Again, same idea. If the object is right around the corner, when you step around the corner, your head's not around before your foot is, you can step something and knock it over, and you can't be expected to watch where you're going. So what happened in all these three instances of answers, the Gemara said, oh, don't you have to watch where you're going? And the Gemara said, these three Amoraim answered by saying, you know what, you're right, you do have to watch where you're going. Normally you would be chayav, and that's the important part. So why does the Mishnah say patur? Shimon is patur. Let's change what the Mishnah is talking about. The Mishnah is talking about a different situation. Either the way it was blocked because it was full of barrels, or it was in the dark they couldn't see, or it was right around the corner they couldn't see. So those are all different situations, different ways of answering the question by changing what the Mishnah is talking about that solves the problem. As we pointed out, this way of solving the problem is called an ukimta. It's where you solve a problem by changing the situation, right? You say, right? So again, like I said, if a teacher walks into class and says, you are permitted, let's say in my class, you're not allowed to eat in class unless you get permission. So if I walk in one day and say, you're allowed to eat in class, so a student's going to ask, wait, how could that be? You're not allowed to eat in class. That's a problem because you always said you're not allowed to. So someone could say, no. What Mr. Adar meant is we're talking about a situation where you ask permission first. So what you did was I had a statement which was you're allowed to eat in class. There was a problem with that. That's against my rules. And you solve it by limiting and saying, no, you're only talking about a situation where you ask permission. That's what our Gemara does. You have to watch where you're going. How could the Mishnah say you're patur? Don't you have to watch where you're going? No, the Mishnah is talking about a different situation where you wouldn't have to watch where you're going. So after listing those three answers, the Gemara goes on to address a problem with one of the answers. The problem is with Rav's answer, because Rav says we're talking about a case where the barrels were blocking your way. The problem with that is that if the barrels are blocking your way, you'd be allowed to smash them on purpose, not just by accident. Yet the Mishnah says only vinit kalba v'shivra patur. Only if you trip on it your patur, which implies that if you break it on purpose, you're chayav. So the other two answers make sense. If it's in the dark and you see that it's there, you can't break it on purpose. If it's around the corner and you see that it's there, you can't purposely break it, only if it's by accident, which is why the Mishnah then says if you tripped. But according to Rav, who says that your airway is blocked, you'd be allowed to break them on purpose, why does the Mishnah only say by accident? What we're going to do is we're going to read this through quickly. I'm not going to focus on this so much on the test, but we should at least get the facts down. The Mishnah only works out according to Shmuel and Rav Yochanan. The Ikara, but according to Rav, my iriya nitka. Why does it say they tripped? Afilu shiber nami. Even if you did it on purpose, you would also be patur. So why wouldn't the Mishnah not list a situation where even if you broke it on purpose, you'd be patur? By saying that if you tripped on it, you're patur, that implies if you did it on purpose, you'd be chayav. So what are we going to do with that? It seems like Rav is wrong. So Rav Zvid mishmei de Rava. So Rav Zvid quotes Rav as answering the question. Here's how he answers it. Hu adin afilu shiber. No, really, even if you break it on purpose, you'd be patur. So why does the Mishnah only say if you tripped on it, you'd be patur? V'hayde katani nitzkal, I did the by limit in the seifa, because it needed to mention in the seifa, which is when we don't have it in front of us, but the second half of the Mishnah, which says v'im huzak ba bal chayvit chayav, that the person was injured by tripping over it, the owner of the barrel has to pay benizko for the injury. The dafka nitkal, that only makes sense if the person trips. About shiber lo, but not if you break it on purpose. My time, but why would you not get your injuries paid for if you broke the barrel on purpose? Hu da'azik anafshe, because you're damaging yourself, you're injuring yourself. If you step on the barrel and smash it on purpose, and then you cut yourself, that's considered to be injuring yourself, and the owner of the barrel would not have to pay. So in order to have a situation to teach us where the owner of the barrel should have to pay, therefore Katani, it had to talk about a situation where you tripped. Therefore Katani Rishon. That's why the first half talks about where you tripped also. All you really need to know about this, again, extra credit to know the details, but all you really need to know is that the Gemara brings up a problem with Rav, because according to Rav, you'd be allowed to break it on purpose, and yet the Mishnah only says you could break it that if you break it by accident, you're patur. And the Gemara answers by saying that the reason why the Reisha mentioned that you're only patur only if you tripped on it is because the case in the Seifa only made sense if you tripped on it. Okay. Then that's the end of the first part. So again, question: don't you have to watch where you're going? Answer: 3 of Kim does. Maybe we're talking about where it's in the dark, or it's around the corner, or it's the area is filled with barrels. Question on Rav's answer that the area is filled with barrels, and solution to that question that the reason why he talks about where it was only an accident is because the seifa only makes sense if it was by accident. Okay. Then what the Gemara does is go on to a totally new way of solving this problem. The entire time we were assuming that a person has to watch where you're going, and that's why maybe we're talking about it's in the dark, blah blah blah. We're going to have another way of looking at this, of looking at this halacha, and then we're going to have two halachot that come up, and we'll explain those, and afterwards we'll wrap it up by reading and translating both Gemaras. Before we do that, I forgot I had this slide in here. Again, this is just illustrating the Gemara's question with Rav. Right, so the Mishnah says if you break the barrel, you're patur. So if it's around the corner, then that only applies by accident, which is why the Mishnah says it's kalba if you tripped on it. If it's in the dark, that's also only by accident. Are you patur for breaking it? It's kalba if you tripped on it. But if the area is blocked, you're allowed to do it even on purpose. So why did the Mishnah say that only if you tripped? Okay, that's in the past already. Let's move on to the next. Okay, so let's zoom in a little here. This was what was said in the west. You have to know that the west is Israel because it's the west of Bavel. Mishmei Ravula in Ravula's name. It's not normal for someone to really be in detail, right? Really watch out where they're going. So this takes the whole thing and flips it on its head. We were assuming up until now that you do have to watch where you're going, and that's why maybe it's talking about in the dark, blah 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 blah. The Gemara says in Israel, the way we look at it is that a person is not expected to watch where they're going, and therefore if Reuven puts a barrel out in public, no matter what, if Shimon steps on it and breaks it, even if it's during the daytime, even if you could have watched where you were going, you are patur because a person should not have to watch where they're going. So again, according to the answers in Bavel, the Mishnah says that you're patur, and in order to solve the problem, you say, the Mishnah is talking about a certain situation, only if it's in the dark, around the corner. According to the way they answered in Israel, you read the Mishnah face value, exactly as it reads. If you step on it and break it, you're patur no matter what. Why? Because a person is not expected to watch where they were going. That's the difference between the two. The Talmud Bavli assumes a person does have to watch, and in the Israel, they assume that you don't have to watch where you're going. Okay. Now the Gemara moves on to two cases where someone stepped on a barrel in public and the ruling was chayav. Hava uvda ben erda. There was a situation in erda where someone broke a barrel by stepping on it in public. V'chiev Shmuel. Shmuel said the person is chayav for breaking it. The opposite of the Mishnah. It happened in Pumbedita also. V'chiev Rava, and Rava said the person was chayav. Okay, so what's the reason for these rulings? So Bishlam is Shmuel kishmate. It makes sense that Shmuel would say you're chayav in this case kishmate, like he ruled before. When did he rule before? He ruled before that our Mishnah only makes sense that you're patur if it's in the dark. That implies that if it's not in the dark, in a normal case, you'd be chayav. So we understand why in this case, in Neherda, Shmuel said you're chayav. Ela Rava lemek Shmuel savar leisa. But according to Rava, are we going to say that he holds like Shmuel? Not that that's necessarily a problem, but is the Gemara asking, are we assuming that Rava holds like Shmuel and says that in general you're actually chayav for stepping on a barrel in public unless there's no way you could have looked out for it? That's the way it seems. That's why he said chayav. The Gemara says no. Amar Rav Papa karna da'atzra have. Here Rav Papa says no. The case Rava's situation where he said chayav was actually a case where even though normally you don't have to watch where you're going, in this case you would. Why? Karna da'atzra have. It was by an olive press. The kivan de brishut ka'avde, and the important part is that people always have their barrels out in public by an olive press. So you should have to watch where you're going. You have to know your situation. Keep the reshut ka'avde, since the person who put their barrel out there was doing it quote unquote with permission, because it's normal for people to leave their barrels out in public. A person has to watch where they're going, and Rava actually holds that a person normally does not, but in this case you would. As opposed to Shmuel, who holds a person normally does have to watch where they're going and would be chayav, except in a case like his Ukimta said, where it's in the dark and you can't watch where you're going. So just to those opinions. So Shmuel's assumption is that you do have to watch where you're going. Therefore, normally you'd be chayav. The exception would be if you're in the dark, you can't see. Rava holds normally you don't have to watch where you're going. Therefore, in a normal case, if you stepped on our barrel, you'd be patur. So why in our case did he rule chayav? Because in our case, the barrel was expected to be there because it was near an olive press where people were always leaving barrels around. Therefore, you should have watched where you're going, and therefore you are chayav. In that case only as an exception. Alright, so now I'm going to read and translate Unit 9, and then I'll read and translate Unit 8 afterwards, through each one once through, and then I'll call it a night. Well, I'll have a bowl of cocoa pebbles, and then I'll call it a night. Okay, let's go. So quoting from the Mishnah, and someone comes along, trips on the barrel, and breaks your patur. Here we go. Follow along, people. Amai patur, why are you patur? A person should have to watch where they're going. They should be chayav. Amr de Rav Mishmei, the Rav student said in his name, we're talking about a case where the person filled the Rishut HaRav in the public area completely with barrels. Shmuel said it's talking about in the dark. Rav Yochanan Amar b'Karen Zava, it's where it's around the corner. Okay, 3 different ukimtas to solve this problem. Amr Rav Papa said, Lo deka matnit, the Mishnah only works out, makes sense, Ella oka Shmuel, like Shmuel, oka Rav Yochanan, like Rav Yochanan. To Ikarav, but because if you agree with Rav, my irya nitkal, why does the Mishnah only say you tripped? Afilu shiber nami, even if you broke it on purpose, you should also be patur. So why does it only say if you tripped? So Rav Zud Mishmei de Rava, Rav Zud quotes Rava to answer this question. Hu adin da afilu shiber. No, really, even though it says if you tripped at your patur, you'd also be patur if you stepped on it on purpose. And Rav works out. So when the Haydik Atani nitkal, why does it only say if you tripped your patur? Because I did the Baile Midney Seifa and Muzak Babala Bain Chayav Benisko, since it needed to mention and teach in the Seifa that if a person tripped over it, the person who tripped got injured by it, the owner of the barrel has to pay for the injuries. Dafka Nitkal, that only works out. That's Dafka specifically Nitkal if you tripped. Aval Shiber Lo, but if you broke it on purpose, you would not. The owner of the barrel would not pay for your injury if you cut your leg. My time. What's the reason? Hu da'azik nafshe, because you'd be injuring yourself. So since in the case in the Seifa, where it talked about injuring yourself and that the owner of the barrel has to pay, only works out if you trip by accident, so too, Katani Reisha, the first part had to also teach Nitkal where you tripped. But really, in the first case, you'd also be Patur if you stepped on it on purpose and broke it on purpose. That's how Rav would read this Mishnah. So Rav can read this Mishnah in that way, and therefore it's not necessarily a problem reading the Mishnah according to Rav. So now the second part. Amar le Rav Ashi. Rav Abba said to Rav Ashi, Hachi Amar Mimarav. This is what they said in the west, in Israel. Remember, because from Israel's to the west of Bava. Mishmei Ravula, in Ravula's name. It doesn't matter. There's no responsibility is based on what human nature is. And since it's not human nature, that the way of people to watch where they're going, so you can't hold a person responsible to watch where they're going, so you don't need all these ukimtas. The Mishnah can be read at face value. The person does not have to watch where they're going, and in any case, when the barrel's out in public and you step on it, you are patur. Okay, now you have 2 situations. There was a situation in Neherda, the city of Neherda, where someone stepped on a barrel in public and broke it, or any object in public and broke it. The Chiyev Shmuel said you're chayav. But Pumbedita, the same thing happened in Pumbedita, that city. The Chiyev Rava said the person was chayav to pay for the barrel. Why? So Bishlam Shmuel makes sense. Why? Kishmate, like he taught earlier. Shmuel here had taught, Ba'afela Shanu, the only time that you're patur is if it's in the dark where you can't see. So therefore, if it's not in the dark you can't see, you'd be chayav. So that it makes sense. Shmuel makes sense that he'd say chayav in this case. Ela Rava lemak Shmuel. So what are we going to say? Rava holds like Shmuel, is that you're normally chayav because you have to watch where you're going, unless it's an exception. No. Amar of Papa says, Karna da'atzra have. This situation was a case where it was near the wine press, the olive press. The olive press. I keep messing that up. Why does that matter? Since the barrels were being put out there, they were doing it with permission, right? Meaning it's normal to have barrels placed out near the olive press. The person should have watched where they're going. So Rava does not agree with Shmuel that a person normally has to watch where they're going. A person normally does not have to watch where they're going. But this case was different because it was near an olive press where people normally leave their barrels out. So therefore, it's like they have permission to leave them out there. So you got to know where you are. You have to watch where you're going. And now to read Unit 8 ones through. Sorry about the colors and the circles. I try to follow along anyway. So we had a Mishnah first. Again, if someone leaves a kad, a jar at Rishon Rabim in public, uba acher, someone else comes along and trips on it, Shivram breaks it, patur, the person who trips on it is patur for breaking it. Vim hu zakban, if they got injured by it, balabat, chavit, the owner of the barrel, chayav miniska, must pay for the barrel. Must pay for the injury to the person who tripped and fell. So again, you break the barrel, you're patur. You get injured, the owner of the barrel has to pay for it. It's their fault for setting up something that's going to trip you. Okay. So again, the reason why I circled these words is because you see where kad and chavit are interchangeable, are used to refer to the same object. The Gemara points out, patach b'chad v'siyem b'chavit. The Mishnah started by calling an object a kad, then called the same object a chavit. V'tzanan nami, guess what? There's another Mishnah that teaches this. It was also taught similarly in a Mishnah, same thing. Here's a Mishnah that teaches the same thing. Zeba b'chavito, if someone was carrying a barrel, v'zeba b'karato, someone else carried a beam. Nishbara kadosh al zeh, if this person's kad, not chavit, broke on the karato on the other person's beam, patur. The person who owns the beam is patur. Again, the Gemara points out in this Mishnah, patach b'chavit siyem b'kad. It started off by calling the object a chavit, then called it a kad. V'tzna nami, and another Mishnah teaches like this: zeba b'chavit doshel yain. If one person is carrying a barrel of wine, v'zeba b'kado shel devash, someone's carrying a kad, a jar of devash of honey. Nistako chavit shel devash, the barrel of devash, not the kad, the barrel of devash then broke. And the person who had the barrel spilled out the wine, and saved the wine betocho into his barrel, which was now empty of wine. Ein lo elas schar, only gets paid for his work, but not for the wine that he spilled out. And again, for the test, the content of this Mishnah is not so important. The most important part is patach b'kad v'seim b'chavit. The Gemara points out again, look, it started by calling an object a kad, then called it a chavit. Why is that? Rav Papa said, Hainu kad, Hainu chavit. To teach us that kad and chavit can refer to the same object, but the same object can be thought of as a kad and a chavit. Who cares? Why are you teaching this? It matters for business transactions. That in business transactions, if an object like a chavit, a barrel, can be thought of both as a kad and a chavit, that actually has an effect when it comes to business. That whenever there's a situation where a statement or an object can be thought of in two different ways, each way of thinking is legitimate, and if a person has the money in their hand and the other person is trying to get the money from them, the person who has the money can claim, no, I was thinking one way, even though you might be thinking another way. Okay. So again, Amra Papa Hainu Kad and Chavit and Kad can mean the same thing. Who cares? Business transactions. Again, Rashi says, it said the owner of the seller can give the buyer whichever one he wants once he gives him the money. Even if the seller said chavit, demashma gadol, which sounds like a bigger one, notin lo kad, the seller can give a kad as long as he's assuming that as long as that's what he thought the guy meant, shiktana, which is smaller. Okay, when is this case even relevant? In a situation, if it's in a place where nobody calls a chavit a kad and nobody calls a kad a chavit, halo karla, no one calls it that. So you would never claim that the person could say, "Oh no, when you said chavit, I was thinking jar." What do you mean? No one calls a jar chavit in this place. You couldn't be thinking that. So that seems to be not. So when is this case relevant? When is this halacha relevant? No, lo tzricha. Is this necessary to teach us? It is a chidush. When deruba karlo kad. Most people call a kad, ulachavit a chavit, and call a barrel a chavit. So most people only use the word chavit to refer to barrel and kad to refer to a jar. So then the majority seems to be against the seller, who tries to claim that when you said chavit, I could also think of it as a jar. Sorry, some people actually call, but there are some people like the seller who call a chavit a kad and a kad a chavit, use them interchangeably, but only some. So what happens in this case? How is this a chidush? Because you might have thought zil bataruba, go based on the majority. The majority don't use these words interchangeably, and therefore the seller should have to give the money back. Nope. Kamash Malam, it comes to teach us ein holchim b'mon achar rov. Majority is not enough. When it comes to monetary matters, we don't follow the majority because rov is not proof, and in order to get money from someone, you have to prove it. So you can't say, "Oh, seller." Most people wouldn't think about a jar when you say chavit. So then, since most people, 75% wouldn't think that way, therefore for sure you weren't thinking that way. No, the guy could say, "No, I'm with the 25%. I think like the 25%, and therefore you can't take the money away from me." Good luck, guys. We'll watch this in class tomorrow. That would be Monday. We'll give you time to watch, to ask questions, and good luck studying.